Hi, Teresa again here from Humanitarians, and we're going to look into a little more detail about the key components of security management. As I like to say, effective threat identification and management is not a task for optimists. You have to be able to see every possible threat, even the ones that may sound or seem really improbable or have never ever happened. You have to remember that the things that happen in humanitarian work are sometimes pretty crazy and surreal. A lot of us have managed very surreal events. The point is, if you don't see a threat, you can't do anything about it. I learned that the hard way. It is better to be prepared for something that never happens than to not be prepared for something that does. Threat management is all about preparedness. Threat identification as well should never be done quietly in some room by just a few select people. This is a big problem. It needs to be a team game. Team and community. It needs to be as expansive as possible. And yes, the past must inform the threat identification and everything else. Not the past of last month, the more distant past. Past is very important. You'll be surprised how many times a threat manifests or materializes that has had its beginnings in something that happened years ago. People living in communities have very long memories, as we do, especially for things that affect them, as is normal. You also need to look at what threats are manifesting to other people outside of your organization. That is the broader threat landscape, because sometimes we only look at the threats that are affecting us, but we have to look at also the threats that are affecting different actors, different groups of population, because that gives us a more informed perspective on the threat landscape, rather than just looking at what could happen to us. If your threat identification or risk analysis is very short, that's a sign you need to do it again. There should never be a short threat analysis. It's better to have a long threat analysis and shorter plan than a short risk analysis and a 40-page security plan that nobody reads. I personally don't think, as I said before, that trying to calculate the probability of a threat happening is much use, especially if you haven't analyzed all the variables or all of the trigger factors that could make it happen. For example, let's take a carjacking. If carjacking is very frequent, putting a probability on it won't change anything. You know, if it exists in the context, if it is a possibility, then what does it matter how probable it is? If there never has been any carjacking event, there's always a first time, right? So always have carjacking on. Carjacking depends on motivation versus the effort and cost of executing a carjacking. So instead of trying to guess if the risk of carjacking is high, low, or medium probability, it's better to spend your time analysing how the different carjackings have been carried out, if there have been any, or how they could be carried out. Where would be the best place? Why would they be carried out? By who? Etc. And then mitigate better measures that are more specific and put a contingency plan to manage it if it does happen. Failure to analyze the how and why of things is a big problem in threat management. Then, impact is the next thing we try to guess at. Impact understood as consequences if a threat manifests. But as we will discuss throughout, impact is a tricky devil, both for programs and for security management. I personally think that being more specific about possible consequences, always with the view to mitigating them, is more effective security management than trying to put on a severity rating to a particular consequence. To go back to armed attacks on vehicles, as I said before, no two vehicle ambushes are the same. So how to evaluate the impact and what would be the point? The point of consequence or impact analysis in theory is to help decide if the consequence is acceptable, more on that later, and in theory, to design measures to reduce the severity of each potential consequence if the threat happens. So in a way, we're thinking, okay, this threat is likely to happen, Therefore, let me act on reducing the consequences of the threat when it happens. The point is that the measures reduce the unacceptable level to a more acceptable level. That's the theory anyway. But in practice, again, usually mitigation is weak. Mitigation of each consequence, I mean. The better way is, in my opinion, each consequence should have its own range rather than giving it a severity rating. What do I mean by a range? For example, if 4 people are in an ambush, each person will have experienced it differently and need different things. Everybody's different, right? No 2 people are the same. Each ambush as well will vary in degrees of violence and duration depending on who carried it out, how and why, and above all, their state of mind and the weapons they have. Again, no 2 events are the same. Then, worryingly, there are attempts to guess the probability of a threat happening and its severity in places where we've just arrived. That's often where the worst threat analyses are carried out, and when threats tend to be more prevalent because there are so many unknowns, including us, for the people there. This happens because we haven't had time to build any relationships and our reputation or value is not known. And also our knowledge of the environment is limited. We must never forget, as I said before, especially in newer contexts, to look at threats from other people's perspectives outside our own organization and never forget that we too are a threat. Outsiders coming in are always a threat, especially when you're coming in with a lot of resources or substituting other people's functions, status, etc. We forget to look at that because we are so busy looking out at what might happen to us that we don't see who is looking in at us as a threat. When in a new environment for the first time, threat identification especially needs to be very expansive and mitigation measures very strong and broad and specific until you have a better understanding of the operating environment and a better contextual understanding of the nuances of the operating environment. This is essential for effective security management.